Well, good morning, everyone. I think, absent any further instruction, I'll start out. I'm Stephen Flanagan from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and it's a pleasure to join you to be, first of all, back here in Bratislava, particularly in this dazzling hotel, which is the new Bratislava. Our topic we turn now, and the previous session was a nice setup to it, looking at Eastern Partnership 2.0. This is, I guess we could call it Reset Plus 2. 2 years after the U.S.-Russia reset is what our organizers have asked us to look at. Rethink or continue? That's the question. And we're delighted we have a very good group joining us this morning of a transatlantic and broad Euro and Eurasian set of expertise to address this question. But it does seem timely. It is 2 years, as your program noted, that the foreign minister of the United States and Russia pressed the reset button. 2 years of a course, and President Obama announced his intent to put the relationship on a new course and reverse what he called a dangerous drift. So I think it is timely to have this kind of a reassessment or assessment and consideration of the future. So what questions we want to look at in this session is, has the policy shift altered the fundamental nature of the U.S.-Russian relationship? What impact has it had on Europe's relations with Russia? How has it affected Russian policies toward NATO, the OSCE, other elements of multilateral cooperation, and its regional activities? So those are some of the main questions we want to touch on. Now, some in the Obama administration, if they had it to do over, might be inclined to have found a different moniker, a different label for this policy, because particularly, and since we are meeting here in Central and Eastern Europe, there was some here who interpreted it to mean a wiping of the slate clean, of ignoring troubling developments in internal Russian affairs and foreign policy in an effort to advance broader U.S. strategic and global interests. And I think we'll have a chance to discuss whether that assessment or whether that concern is valid or has been proven wrong by policy developments since that time. But by whatever name, the policy that the White House chose in advancing relations with Russia is certainly one of the president's most important foreign policy achievements. And he has noted in a number of times a number of tangible steps forward in a range of bilateral, regional, and global issues that we'll consider and discuss, and also, as I said, to look at how this has impacted Europe's relationships. So we want to discuss the benefits and shortcomings, the risks of the reset and U.S.-Russia relations from the perspective of the two main protagonists first, United States and Russia, and then talk a little bit about other perspectives, Central and Eastern Europe, but also from some third countries in Asia, particularly China, Iran, and the Arab Middle East. We also want to consider some of the questions and the implications for arms control and disarmament process, efforts to counter terrorism and weapons of mass destruction proliferation, various regional challenges, and future security architecture in Eurasia. And then we'll turn towards the end to look at both what are the priorities of various actors in this process and how durable is this rapprochement between Russia and the West. So let me get to a brief introduction of our panelists, and I'll introduce them not in protocol order, but in the order I'm going to call on them to speak. First of all, Alexander Nikitin, who is, to my immediate left, who is professor and director of the Center for Euro-Atlantic Security at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, MIGIMO, and a respected analyst on security and arms control policy issues. So we're delighted to have him with us. To my right, Jeremy Shapiro, who is special advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Philip Gordon, and a former senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he was also research director of the Center for the United States and Europe. Next, second to my right is certainly someone who doesn't need an introduction in this room to all of our Slovak friends, your former Foreign Minister, Ambassador MIROSLAV LAJČák, who is now several months into his LAJČák, who is managing director of Europe and Central Asian affairs in the External Action Service of the European Union, having, as I said, served as most recently as Foreign Minister here. And last but not least, Dr. BOBO Lo, who's now an independent consultant, but previously led the Russia and China program at the Center for European Reform and also the Russia-Eurasia program at Chatham House, both in London. And he also has, of course, experience in diplomacy as deputy head of the Australian mission in Moscow. So let's turn to our first few questions. As I said, let's get from the two main protagonists a sense of, well, how has the reset fared? What has the reset delivered? So first, turning to Alexander Nikitin, how is the Kremlin seen? What is the Kremlin seen as the most important political and strategic gains of the reset so far? And how do you assess its progress?
First of all, I suggest to analyze this metaphor of reset. You are resetting your computer when you have problems, but it only helps when your problems are on the surface. If you really have deep viruses in your software, or if your hardware is incompatible, then resetting, reswitching it doesn't help much. You need reconfiguration of the whole system. And from this point of view, Russia has a lot of hopes in connection with reset, but these hopes are pragmatic and sometimes limited. We realize that, first of all, we need this reset to provide favorable external condition for domestic modernization. But also there is more ambitious geopolitical goal, and this is to truly bring Russia back to the decision-makers table in the global security issues, because on the previous stage of history, say in the 90s, Russia was visibly and willingly limited herself to regional power and regional aspirations. Then with Putin and later Medvedev, it returned back to the pretensions into being in a global powers family. And it was Ronald Reagan who said that you need two for tango. From this point of view, reset only can work well if both sides are more or less synchronized in the approach. And I know other processes when partners better be synchronized. For example, ratifications in parliaments. Mm-hmm. And in recent 2 years, we had at least 5 areas where some achievements were visible in this process of reset. And first of all, New START, Treaty on Nuclear Strategic Arms Reduction. Second, the overcoming of the ABM crisis over planned deployment in Poland and Czech Republic of components for the IBM system. And now we have much more cooperative dialogue on the IBM in a different direction. Third, definitely we have now more synchronization in our non-proliferation policies, for example, on positions towards Iran and North Korea. Fourth, definitely Russia and America managed to do quite positive cooperation on Afghanistan. And finally, fifth, and here already there are some question marks, we do cooperate in counterterrorism, in conflict resolution, in energy security, but all these areas already have question marks whether or not the reset really brought something deeply new into these areas. So all in all, yes, reset works in the right direction, but as Western media teaches us, good news are no news. So I want to stress some problems with these reset policies as well, especially because we are just starting discussion. We need some momentum for debates. So on START treaty, which is normally presented as the best achievement between Obama's administration and Russian administration. The problem is that if you remember, sides failed to sign the treaty between September and December of 2009 when the previous treaty was coming to an end, and it was a nervous period until the last days before the NPT review conference in New York, when just literally days before it would be too late, the sides were able to sign the treaty, and a treaty which in fact sets the ceilings for nuclear strategic warheads, which are about 20% only lower than what was set by the previous treaty signed in 2002, the so-called Moscow Treaty. So numerically, this new treaty is a big political success, but technically, militarily, its importance is quite relative, especially if we remember that approximately 90 or above 90% of all nuclear weapons in the world are still, even after this treaty, concentrated in the hands of two powers, Russia and America, and this treaty didn't brought other nuclear powers closer to the multilateral nuclear dialogue. Secondly, this treaty never touched the issue of tactical nuclear weapons, and let me remind you that still both sides do not even make transparent the numbers. The figures are still secret, how many tactical nuclear weapons either side have, and we do not have any agreement or not even any negotiations which are covering these thousands of tactical nuclear weapons which are still at the hands of the sides. And there are a lot of debates between technical and military people regarding the methods of counting which are used in the new treaty. And let me remind you that the ratification also didn't went without problems. Everything went well, but let me remind you that START II treaty was 7 years under consideration in the Russian parliament, and finally American Congress and Russian parliament ratified the different versions of the treaty with amendments which are mutually exclusive, and this killed the previous START II treaty. This is why now, when we again have ratification of new START with some amendments from American side, some amendments from the Russian side, they are much softer than amendments of the previous generation, but still they create some question marks how the treaty will be implemented. On IBM system, also, we should dig deeper than the reset. Russia suggested the joint theater ballistic missile, anti-ballistic missile system with Europe already in the beginning of the 2000s, almost 10 years ago. And practically Russia, by the way, now holds the only existing in the world working system of missile defense, the 100 interceptors which are stationed around Moscow. And Russia is not at all foreign to the idea of having ABM defense. Russia has it on this residual level from the ABM, 30 years of the ABM treaty, which is old, rusty, inefficient system. But secondly, Russia developed the theater missile system like S-300, S-400, which in combination with some American systems like PAC-3 and others really could work well. And again, this dialogue was started much earlier before the reset. During the reset, we only produced in Lisbon summit the decision that until June of 2011, we would produce new decision. Mm-hmm. And right now, we're in the middle of these 6 months when Russia and America are seriously considering whether or not the configuration of the potential IBM system is realistic. If yes, would this be two parallel systems or one joint system?
Could I just ask you to just stop there for now? I wanted to come back to some of these issues. You raised some very important points, and I want to come back, and before we delve into the depths of arms control, let me just ask Jeremy Shapiro for his...
But if you allow me just one phrase,
okay,
to change the tone. I don't want to finish on this negativism. I just want to stress that. All in all, still let me say that we feel now that together with Americans we are on the same side, and the problems like instability or destabilization in some conflict areas like Afghanistan, like Caucasus, is on the other side. And yes, in general, my estimation is that reset works, only slowly and pragmatically.
Okay, perfect. Jeremy Shapiro, same question for you, and particularly maybe if you could pick up a couple of the points that Dr. Nikitin made about really has there been that much progress on Afghanistan, counterterrorism, some of the issues aside from arms control, and I think that probably is something that you may plan to touch on in any event in your...
Yeah, I was planning on filibustering for a while, so I'll definitely touch on all of those issues. And I wanted to thank the organizers for allowing me to come and allowing me this platform, and I wanted to thank, I guess, the audience especially for persevering to this point in the conference, which is very impressive, frankly. I think it's important as we think about the reset, as we try to assess the reset, to really remember the point of departure, to remember where we were in 2008. We were at a point of, I think, very dangerous drift in U.S.-Russian relations. We had a lot of sort of zero-sum conflicts in the neighborhood. We had gas wars in 2006, cyber war in 2007, an actual war in 2008. We had an erosion of democracy within Russia. The Freedom House score of Russia in 2000 was 4.58. It had fallen to 6.14, which is bad, by 2009. And there was talk of a new Cold War emerging. The theory of the reset that the president put forward when he entered office was that the U.S. and Russia share a variety of common interests, and that these interests had not been pursued in the final years of the Bush and Putin administrations. The goal, and I think this is critical to understand, is not to have a good relationship, but to have a substantive relationship that advances American and allied core interests. This is based on the principle that engagement with the Russian government can produce win-win outcomes in certain circumstances. We will continue to reject the idea of privileged spheres of interest and reject the idea of a great game in Russia and reject the whole notion of that every issue that we deal with in Russia is zero-sum. So we needed to develop a multi-dimensional relationship on the security side, sure, on the economic side, and also through society-to-society contacts. And in fact, I think we also were very well aware that the U.S. needed a good relationship with Russia if the EU was going to be able to have an effective Eastern Partnership, as was alluded to in the last panel. In undertaking this task, we set down certain principles for ourselves. The first one is that we can effectively engage the Russian government and Russian society at the same time. We've always tried to do so. The second is that we can cooperate with the Russian government without checking our values at the door, that there are certain red lines which we will simply not compromise on. The third is that we can pursue the reset with Russia without compromising our relations with countries who have, let's say, difficult relations with Russia, most prominently Georgia, but a whole host of countries on Russia's periphery. And the last is that we can avoid linkage of unrelated issues, which means we can make progress on issues where we agree and put aside issues on which we don't agree. So we've pursued all of these tracks very assiduously. Government-to-government engagement, for example, has been dramatically stepped up. Obama and Medvedev have met 10 times, and they've had many phone calls. Each of the various interlocutors at the levels of government has a strong relationship with his Russian counterpart. And we've increased the number of government-to-government interactions at all levels. To some degree, we do this through the Binational Presidential Commission, which is one of the things that was set up at the first Obama-Medvedev summit and has 18 groups on everything from environment to sports exchanges and involves some 60 agencies of the two governments getting together. We also have a dual-track approach, which is that we do the government-to-government engagement, but we also work very hard on society-society engagement to promote democracy and human rights. So we bring that up in every bilateral meeting that we have. The civil society working group that I mentioned has 4 subgroups on issues like prisons, corruption, child protection, and migration. And we have a host of statements in support of democratic development and critical human rights issues. Over 60 in the 2 years of the reset. You can find them on the State Department website if you're desperately interested. I'll read you just one because I think it's sort of important to understand how we get these things out there. This is from the White House. The United States reiterates the importance of embracing and protecting universal values, including freedoms of expression and assembly enshrined in the Russian Constitution, as well as in international agreements which Russia has signed. Freedom of assembly and freedom of expression are also characteristic of a modern political system that supports economic modernization. The infringement of Russian citizens' rights to exercise these freedoms runs counter to our shared commitments to international norms and common interests in fostering modernization. The United States remains committed to supporting those in Russia and around the world who work to protect and advance the human rights and democratic values of their fellow citizens. So that's a White House statement from this past August. And we give life to that type of statement through the societal engagement piece of the reset, which has always been part of the concept. And the idea here is to engage and strengthen Russian democratic and civil society actors. And U.S. officials engage directly and regularly with Russian NGOs and society. And they've expanded their support for democracy and human rights for programs on rule of law, human rights, civil society, media, political processes, etc. And we're also engaging with the political opposition. We're also, as part of that, fostering peer-to-peer dialogue between American and Russian civil society. We had 2 parallel civil society summits in combination with 2 of the Obama-Medvedev summits in Moscow and Washington. We have peer-to-peer dialogue in all of the binational presidential commission working groups. We've set up a bunch of exchange programs between the U.S. and Russia. We did 50 cultural events in Russia last year, and we've set up a new Fulbright program. It goes on and on. Okay. So the results of this reset, I think, are some of the things that we got into. The START treaty, I don't need to go into again, but I think there's a lot more. Afghanistan, we've worked very strongly with Afghanistan on counter-narcotics and on supplies in particular. Russia is critical to the Northern Distribution Network, which supplies 45% of the cargo that goes to Afghanistan, and 60% of that goes through Russia. They've shipped 20,000 containers in the last 2 years to Afghanistan, 4,300 U.S. flights, including 800 flights of lethal transit, and over 120,000 U.S. personnel have transited Russia on their way to Afghanistan. Our cooperation on Kyrgyzstan has been very, very good. We no longer face Russian pressure to close the base at Manas, and we were able to create a coordinated response to the violence there. On Iran, I think as well known, we've been closely cooperating with them on Iran in a very strong contrast to where we were 3 years ago. We jointly developed the Tehran Research Reactor proposal, and we came together on UN Security Council Resolution 1929, which put into place a lot of sanctions that the Russians have followed, and in fact followed up by a cancellation of their S-300 missile sale to Iran, which is something we had been asking for a long time, and that contract was canceled, and the money was refunded, which is not something that the Russians like to do. Okay, so just a couple of other areas. North Korea, missile defense, already mentioned. The improvement in Russian relations with NATO, which I think concomitant of the...
We can come back to some of these too, and I'm sorry not to rush.
Sure. I just wanted to sort of finish up, because I think there's a lot of other things I could talk about, but I think it's to understand the overall concept. It's important to think about what we call the dogs that didn't bark. If you think back again to 2008, what were people predicting? They were predicting renewed military conflict in Georgia. They were predicting energy coercion against Europe. They were predicting a strong Russian negative reaction to U.S. and NATO missile defense plans in Europe. And they probably would have predicted, if you'd asked them, a blow-up of the reset because of, say, spy expulsions, the types of revelations that we saw in WikiLeaks. None of that happened. And I think the absence of that goes a long way to understanding how the better context of the U.S.-Russian relation can spill over into other areas and make international life quite a bit easier.
Okay. Just one phrase. Methodologically, I suggest not to place everything what is happening in Russian-American relations into the basket of reset. There is business as usual. There are tracks which are here for decades. And reset probably is a combination of several breakthroughs which we have. And here I completely with you on.
Sure, and I mean I think it needs. That's absolutely fair, and I think it's only added somewhat to the atmosphere and it's made a bunch of things easier. But there's still a lot of work to do there's still a lot of things that we don't agree on, and maybe we will never agree on. I mean, Georgia comes very strongly to mind. We haven't made a lot of progress on Georgia have made a lot of progress on Georgia.
That's a classic.
There are different things as well. Whiskey or vodka, we never can.
Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do, and the reset doesn't solve every problem between the U.S. and Russia. The idea is that it makes the atmosphere better so that we can at least start to address some of these problems.
Agree.
Do you agree with that? Okay. All right, good. All right. Ambassador LAJČák, I wanted to ask you a question on the same vein of the overall assessment, but in two of your hats, your current hat in the EU, but also your hat as a Central European and a former Slovak foreign minister. How do you see, first of all, the European Union's relations with Russia being affected by the U.S. Russian reset? But then also on this question of, as Jeremy just alluded to, that the notion that the reset with Russia doesn't come at the expense of our relationship with the U.S. relationship with Central East European countries, that these two processes can unfold in tandem. Are you, as a Slovak, and we're talking on Chatham House rules here, are you reassured? Do you feel? Have you seen concrete steps that demonstrate that these two processes are very much complementary, as the Obama administration has argued?
Thank you. I'll start by saying that yes, the reset has been a success. 2 years ago, when it was announced by Vice President Biden, our relations were at very low, following the war in Georgia and the gas crisis, early 2009. And since then, we've witnessed a number of positive elements, such as the START Treaty, such as Afghanistan Transit Agreement, and good cooperation on issues such as Iran, North Korea, or Kyrgyzstan. We have also witnessed improvement in Russia's relations with Poland, Nordic, Baltic countries, with the United Kingdom, and we have also seen new beginning in NATO-Russia relations. So these are all hard facts. Now the question is reset to be thanked for? Yes, but is reset the only factor behind those positive developments? No. Another one, probably even more important one, has been the financial and economic crisis, I believe, because this was the element that made Russia's government realize that their economy is simply too weak to follow and to pursue this assertive foreign policy that followed the then President Putin's speech at the very same München Forum back in 2007. So as of today, the primary objective of Russia's foreign policy is no longer to create a multipolar world, but to gain economic strength. We have seen President Medvedev saying a number of times that Russia needs to modernize politically and economically. Prime Minister Putin recently, he visited Brussels last week and he brought with him 11 ministers. He spoke about the need for deeper integration between Russia and the European Union. The program of the visit was very concrete. Now, EU's response to this has been positive. First, we concluded an agreement that paves the way for Russia to join the WTO. That means international rules-based organization that deals with issues such as trade, investment, energy. Plus, we've launched a program called Partnership for Modernization. That means we are reacting directly to the President Medvedev's plea for the modernization of the society. But it's important to say that for us, the modernization is not just a set of economic projects. Modernization is a comprehensive program that is being developed within a certain framework. And there are clear elements of that framework, such as the rule of law, efficient system of courts, functioning civil society, visible effort to fight corruption. And we make it very clear with our Russian partners that we will only accept the balanced approach. So progress on one cannot be achieved without progress on the other. Now, what are the perspectives for the future? I believe that we cannot be overly optimistic. The fact is that we are two conflicting factors. On one side, there is this Russian government's intention to modernize the economy. On the other side, there is this notion to stay in control of everything. Yeah. So the reforms effort is state-driven and leaves very little space for a free entrepreneurship, which has been the major force for the modernization of other countries. That's one element. The second element is that many things in Russia depend on the price of oil, which has been currently high, and therefore the pressure to reform is low. So we must not forget that we are heading for parliamentary, for Duma elections later this year, and for presidential elections next year, which will very significantly influence the further course of the Russian Federation. So we have to see, but I believe that there is a risk that the tendency to stay firmly in control will prevail over the need to modernize the society, and that would result in further stagnation of Russian economy and Russian state. But this is not what we want to see. We certainly shall support this plea for modernization, and we shall support Russia's trend to become part of international structures that have clear rules and mechanisms how to deal with crises, unexpected moments in the interest of reliability and predictability. And to answer your second question, from the Central European perspective, I do not think that improvement of US-Russia relationship should automatically be at the detriment of Europe-Russia or Central Europe-Russia relationship or Central Europe-US relationship. And at the same time, I believe that Europe-Russia improvement should also not be to the detriment of US-Russia relationship, because this would be the optics of zero-sum game, and this is not what it... on the contrary, we must not forget that Europe and the US relationship is based on values, on the same values, and we share basically same analysis and same concerns when we discuss the current Russia.
But just to press a little bit, do you think has it helped in the reset, if you will, of Russia's relationship with a number of Central East European countries as well, particularly obviously very visible with Poland, but a number of other countries as well? Has the normalization, if you will, of relations between Central European countries and Russia been advanced by this?
There is no direct dependence or relationship between it, but yes, obviously, the overall improvement of the atmosphere has helped to deal with a number of individual issues such as Russia-Poland relationship.
Okay. Good, thank you. All right, I want to turn to Dr. Lowe and let him pick up. I don't know what the cricket metaphor is, but in baseball we say is our utility outfielder. He's going to cover China, Western Europe, a lot of other, and even the Australian perspective from his home country. But no, seriously, Dr. Lowe, on the issue of, you've heard just a very upbeat assessment, more or less, on the reset. Do you agree? Do you see some differences in other key West European capitals, having lived in London a long time and looked at the relationship from there, but also, what about, do you think the Russians, we can also come back to Professor Nikitin on this, did the Russians get what they wanted in the last EU summit?
Right. Okay.
We are sure Australia is a key to Russian
key, right, exactly, right.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, hosts. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think if we're talking about perceptions in Western European capitals of the reset, I would say they're quite mixed. I would say they're marginally more positive than negative. They're more positive in the sense that Western European capitals certainly see some major achievements from the reset. Compared to the situation, as Jeremy pointed out, compared to the situation in 2008, well, it's certainly vastly improved. They also appreciate that the improvement in US-Russia relations has created a more favorable backdrop, a more favorable context for their own interaction with Moscow. However, there are any number of caveats, and I'm just going to go through them just very briefly. First, there is a feeling in Western European capitals that Washington sometimes has been a little naive in its approach towards Russia. In particular, sort of making this artificial distinction between Putin on the one hand, the authoritarian statist, versus Uncle Fluffy in the form of Medvedev, the liberal modernizer. They also believe that Washington has had a natural, perfectly understandable inclination to talk up the already considerable achievements of the reset because, frankly, it's one of the few areas of recent American foreign policy success. And so it is important to it's a natural tendency in Washington to talk it up. Now, if we move to the substance, Western European capitals tend to believe that Russia, for all the talk about learning the lessons from the global financial crisis and reorienting its foreign policy, well, actually hasn't done all that much. The style of Russian foreign policy has changed. The presentation has become more sophisticated and nuanced, but the core objectives remain the same. And what are these core objectives? Russia as an indispensable player in the world. Russia having a kind of droit de regard, a controlling interest in the former Soviet space. Russia still believing, for all the talk about positive sum and win-win solutions and so on, Russia still believing that geopolitics, if not an emperor, is still a king. And also they are deeply skeptical about the progress in Russia's modernization. You can talk all you like, but where's the walk? Now, they believe on policy differences that the reset hasn't really done much to reconcile significant differences of perception and interest between Europe and Russia, between Moscow and even Washington. And these are over norms and values, over energy security, and this was highlighted at the recent EU-Russia summit, on sort of how you relate to the common neighborhood, NATO's role in European security, and even conventional and nuclear arms control. More generally, I certainly take Ambassador LAJČÁK's point that individual European countries have benefited from the reset. But there is an argument that Europe, as a collective entity, the collective Europe, has lost out from the reset. Because it seems to me that Europe, the collective Europe's place in Russian and American foreign policy has certainly declined in the last 2 years, and also that Moscow's strategic outlook, in particular, has become more, not less, America-centric. Now, to look on slightly the bright side here, as a consequence of this America-centrism, the reset has actually had relatively limited impact on the EU's interaction with Russia. But unfortunately, although Ambassador LAJČák talks up the partnership for modernization, you also highlighted the problems with actually implementing modernization in Russia. And while this happens, it seems to me that this sort of partnership for modernization is really something of a rhetorical conceit, and that Moscow and Brussels remain very far apart on a new cooperation agreement. Now, this does mean, however, that if, and as I believe when, the US-Russia reset falters, to some extent, Europe's relations with Russia will be insulated from the downturn, that it will impact less negatively on Europe's own interaction. Now, one question that's been asked is, well, what do the Europeans want from the reset? Well, of course, you'd like an agreement on NATO, you'd like some sort of consensus on, the future management of energy relations. But I think the single greatest thing that Western European capitals want from the reset is a genuine commitment and progress towards comprehensive modernization in Russia, and picking up Ambassador LAJČÁK's point. Because this would have a number of effects. First, comprehensive modernization in Russia would enable Europe and Russia, America and Russia, to manage or resolve, or at least help manage, the differences that they have on regional and international issues. It would reinforce commercial and security cooperation between Europe and Russia. It would lead to a modest convergence of norms and values. And most of all, modernization in Russia would inevitably lead to a greater Eurocentric focus in Russian foreign policy. I'll leave it there for the time.
Great, thank you, Bobo.
One point of disagreement.
That's exactly what I want.
Agent
Go ahead.
provocateur.
But let me, I want to, and I rest assure the audience, I am going to turn the floor open a little bit. But no, I would like you, Dr. NIKITIN, to offer some reactions to that. And also, what about looking towards the priorities, towards Russia's expectations in its relationship with the West in general, both the U.S., but also with Europe, the European Union, with NATO? what do you see as the priorities ahead? What are the important measures do you think that the Kremlin in particular would like to see out of this relationship, as be it the modernization partnership, other things?
I think BOBO just gave excellent analysis, and I agree with him on almost everything. We spoke before about quality of British beer. We agreed on that as well. But I have one disagreement on the like hidden goals of Russian policy in the times of reset. I don't feel that Russia still have this feeling that we need to repack and still push through the idea that Russia should dominate on post-Soviet space. There's really new element now in Moscow, this element which I call the feeling of the end of post-Soviet space. More and more politicians, more and more ordinary people in Moscow do feel that the former Soviet past is not anymore the most important factor which is between us and the CIS countries. We really feel that there is a split onto different groups of countries which are moving in a different directions, and that new rules of the game already do not bring Moscow like naturally or automatically closer to, say, countries like Armenia or Georgia or Uzbekistan, or we have a feeling that we need hardly fight for the influence and importance in that areas, and very often we find that it's easier to cooperate with Americans on Afghanistan than on Kyrgyzstan. I've been in Kyrgyzstan in the days of events there. I don't have a feeling that Russia and America, the two embassies, for example, cooperated well in the days of crisis. I remember I spoke to Otunbayeva, I spoke to Kulov, and I remember this feeling of loss of this zigzagging between various centers of influence of new Kyrgyz authorities. They were trying to get most of their relations with Americans, but from the other sides, they were asking for some concrete steps from the Russian side. And for example, for 5 days, a letter existed, a formal request from Kyrgyz authorities to interfere somehow. Then this letter was withdrawn, and legal statement was that Kyrgyzstan never asked CSTO or Russia interfere. So the story is not as easy as like a successful cooperation of Russia and US on regional crisis. But coming back to these areas of regional cooperation, last year I went to Afghanistan, heading the UN delegation there, and we went to Afghan-Pakistani border from both sides, from Pakistani as well. And impression definitely was that when, not if, but when Western coalition is going to leave from Afghanistan, and after Lisbon summit wording and decisions, we have a clear understanding that 3 years, that's maximum, and military operation of the Western coalition would be wrapped up. This will return back to Russia and to Collective Security Treaty Organization as our problem. And this feeling is very strong in Moscow, that we need now much stronger transit strategy between us and Western coalition, between us and Americans. And here exactly where Europe can help, because Americans just withdrew from Iraq, and the issue is back on the table of, so to say, Security Council of all international forces who are ready to contribute. The same is going to happen regarding a very painful area of Afghanistan. The mechanical wrapping up of military operation will bring it to the table ability of the East and the West, of Russia and America, of CSTO and NATO, to technically cooperate for years and years to come. And unfortunately, I do not see even the beginning of such transit talks. For example, Brussels is still not ready to sit together at the same negotiations table with Collective Security Treaty Organization of 7 countries, which definitely will be responsible for conflict resolution in Central Asia and Afghanistan area afterwards. Not in a sense that they will overstep onto Afghan territory. Never, never, never. Lesson is well taught and well taken. Russians, post-Soviets, whatever you call it, do not want again to be in Afghanistan. But I remember very well in these Pushtun areas where 11 million of Pashtuns are easily crossing the borders between, say, Pakistan and Afghanistan. For them, it's a Schengen zone in its own sense. I mean, borders are open between Turkmenistan, for example, and Afghanistan. 160 kilometers of Uzbek border with Afghanistan is sealed. but the very lengthy border with Turkmenistan and in a less proportion border with Tajikistan is more or less open for the movement of drugs, movement of arms, movement of people. And all the Central Asian area is destabilized and will be destabilized by this emanation of radiation of destabilization from Afghan territory. And again, let me stress, 30 kilometers from each other in Manas and in Kant, NATO military base and Russian CSTO military base, and they do not talk to each other. They don't even have any scenario in the moment of events in Osh between Uzbeks and Kyrgyzs. It was no interaction. I spoke to German ambassador to Moscow, who before was German ambassador to NATO, and he said, we were afraid that any move of NATO would be misinterpreted. And why CSTO didn't interfere and didn't stop the bloodshed? And when I spoke to Secretary General Borduja of CSTO, he said approximately the same. He said, we were not sure how the West will react. Of course, we had like this misunderstanding that Kyrgyzs either asking or not asking us to interfere, but at the same time we didn't have consensus inside the organization. So more dialogue is still needed, and Brussels and NATO and Europeans should be an important part of it.
Okay, thank you. The audience is getting restless. Let me just put one more thing on the table, though. I just want to have Jeremy a chance to say, from the Obama administration's second half of the first term, what are you what are you looking towards in terms of priorities on the aspects of U.S.-Russia relation?
Okay, well, let me back up a little bit. Sometimes when I'm talking about the reset, I feel like I'm a little bit like I'm on a sort of infomercial, and I'm sort of saying, it slices, it dices, it washes your car. And I think maybe we need to understand a little bit what the reset is and it isn't. The reset cannot slice bread. It does not cure cancer. And it won't solve every problem in U.S.-Russian relations. It is an effort to improve the relationship enough so that we could do the things that make sense for both of us to do without the needless acrimony, to improve the atmosphere in the hopes that a more cordial relationship can evolve over time, and not to try to put aside the difficult things that are still out there and that remain out there and that we fight about. And so the point is that evidence of U.S.-Russian or European-Russian problems don't impugn the reset. The reset has to be looked at as relative to the alternatives and relative to if we didn't do it. And I would argue that we have seen results in the last 2 years. We have hopes for results in the next few years, but the game is in no sense over, and it remains that we have a lot of problems.
But do you see a convergence on a modernization prior? Is the economic agenda going to dominate more than the arms control agenda did in the first half?
Yeah, I think that having achieved a lot in the first couple of years in the arms control agenda, I think we're going to be trying to move into the economic realm, not exclusively. Certainly, a priority for this year is to get Russia into the WTO, which we think will help it in the type of evolution that I talked about. We'd like to advance the missile defense cooperation that was referred to. We'd like to make progress on CFE, which is another arms control thing. We'd like to make progress on the unresolved conflicts in the Caucasus, although that remains one of the most difficult areas. And we want to continue and enhance our support for both economic and political modernization. As has been pointed out, this is very, very difficult in Russia for a host of domestic reasons, and frankly, the increase in the oil prices doesn't make it any easier. But I think it's really the only way toward a Russian future which can get us beyond the need to have a reset where we compartmentalize issues and get us to a place where we can have a broad spectrum relationship with Russia like we do with our European partners.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, the audience is getting restless. I had a couple more questions we want to get. I'm sure they'll come up in the context of question of linkage. Jeremy mentioned the notion of delinkage as a clear Obama administration priority. The whole question of how are other parties reacting to this, so someone hopefully will ask Bobo about China. But I saw Konstantin Stenzimula first ask if you could please identify yourself and wait for a microphone. And I see many hands. No, actually, you're not on.
How about this? Okay,
There you
yes,
go.
now it's
Much
working.
better.
I get it. Okay, I'm going to be unkind, Jeremy, and take you up on your little Freudian slip. But this is also addressed to Professor Nikitin. If what you say is true, why are the Russians still in Transnistria? Why are they still in Abkhazia and South Ossetia? It seems to me that foreign policy and security policy, yes, in Georgia, yes, in the occupied parts of Georgia, yes.
Progress, yeah.
Don't worry. In case anybody had wondered, it is an illegal occupation, yes. It seems to me that significant parts of American and Western European foreign and security policy elites have invested, not inconsiderable parts of their reputation, in making the reset work. And I agree with you, Jeremy, and Professor Nikitin, that it has worked on some points, but my position would be it hasn't worked enough.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, has this just simply been a question of priorities? Was Iran and Afghanistan and cooperation there more important than Transnistria and Georgia? Or is it actually proving much more difficult than you thought to get the Russians out of Transnistria and Georgia? Why is there so little movement? And is there perhaps a little movement because what Professor Nikitin says is maybe not true after all, and that the Russians still have a strong feeling towards what we call the post-Soviet space?
Okay.
And
thank you, Constance. I think we have the question.
Can't
Sorry.
move out.
No, there's just a lot of questions. Let me take another couple on the floor, and the gentleman right there on the.
Thank you very much. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Center for European Studies, which is the foundation of the European People's Party. And directly following up on Constanze, you remember the Medvedev doctrine? I think it was fall of 2008, the sphere of privileged interest. Yeah. Now, I've heard much in this panel about the end of thinking in terms of post-Soviet space, but I'm still puzzled. On a much higher level, admittedly, but I'm still puzzled. So could you enlighten me? Let's pinpoint it down on that term. Mm-hmm. Has this ever been withdrawn, this sphere of privileged interest? Has there ever been a follow-up on this, a reformulation, a reset of that thesis? Thank you.
Let's take one more in the middle. Helen was in the middle of the audience, and then. Okay.
Helen Weiderbro from the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. I just wanted to ask you, because since 2008, the reset process has been one process. And in parallel to this, we've had the reassurance of certain allies. So I wanted to ask the panel if they could comment on how they see these two processes together.
Okay, and one last one. Edward Lucas assures me it's truly a two-finger intervention on this, directly on point here.
It's a direct question to Jeremy. Jeremy, will you please make it clear that there's a distinction between partners and allies?
Yeah.
I think people in this part of the world feel they are allies of the United States, and I think they rather resent being termed partners on the grounds you have a lot of partners. China may be a partner.
Yes, you've mentioned that many times.
I'm mentioning it again. I'm going to carry on mentioning it until you change your lexicon.
The problem is that
Okay.
in language there is not a great distinction, but in technical terms there is a huge distinction. It is very important. So I thank Ed for reminding me of it constantly. And the distinction is that with allies we have a treaty relationship, and therefore we have legal obligations to defend them, whereas with partners we have a more informal relationship which covers a wide variety of things. And it's true, I think, and it is not a good idea that especially as he points out in this part of the world, that we slip between those two things. But there is no offense intended, because in the sort of normal English language we do tend to use them interchangeably, even though they have different technical meanings. So thanks for that clarification, Ed.
Do you want to?
Should I continue on?
Go ahead for a minute. Yeah, no.
On Constanza's point, I think you were listening too much to my slip and not to what I just said. The reset does not accomplish everything. It has not solved every problem in U.S.-Russian relations. Primary among the issues it has not solved, in my view, are Georgia and Transnistria. And we have not made much progress in those areas, and it's immensely frustrating to us. And we bring it up at every single meeting. You will not find a meeting between the president and a high-level Russian official, and between the secretary and her counterpart, in which we do not emphasize this problem. We are working very hard at this problem in the Geneva talks right now. We will send deputy assistant secretaries to these talks every day until they die. We can make more. We take this stuff very seriously, but the truth is we are not making a lot of progress. And my view is that's because of intransigence on the Russian side largely. But we have to make do with that. The real question to ask is, given that, should we abandon all of the other things that we're doing with Russia that have created all of the benefits that all of us have put up here? Should we hold nuclear arms reductions hostage to the Georgia problem? Should we hold the ability to transit supplies to Afghanistan hostage to the Georgia situation? And my answer is no. And my answer is, moreover, if we did, the Georgia situation wouldn't be any better. As a matter of fact, it would be worse. And the Georgian government has come to us and said that although they still have innumerable problems with the Russians, the reset has made it easier to deal with them marginally. And so we are moving forward on that basis. I don't expect to solve this problem next year, but I do expect to continue to be working on it.
Professor LAJČÁK wanted to...
just to reinforce Jeremy's message, reset is not a magic wand that will solve all the problems, and certainly not overnight. But reset itself and the current economic situation that stress the understanding of mutual dependence have created more favorable conditions to move ahead and to start the process. And we are now there. And we see progress in a number of areas where there was no progress 2 years ago. And we have to be realistic, but of course at the same time demanding. With regard to Transnistria, there was an interesting meeting between High Representative Ashton and Minister Lavrov this Monday in Geneva. Russians are interested in more deeper and comprehensive cooperation with the European Union in the areas of security and would like to establish sort of regular political dialogue. And our reaction has been, yes, fine, but prove that it can deliver. And Transnistria could be such a proof. So show us you can be constructive, and then we can talk to member states. And we'll go to Moscow next week and discuss Transnistria and turn this process from a talking forum into a real process that will deal with the substance. That means political settlement. Because Russia needs us not less than we are interested in good relations with Russia.
I don't think we quite touched on Helen's question about the processes, or maybe, I don't know if Dr. Lowe or someone else wants to. Do you feel it?
What?
Did you feel you got an answer, Helen, to your question?
Can I?
No, not. But yeah, go ahead.
Can I just pick up on this notion?
The lady next to you will go to next.
The end of the post-Soviet space, because it is important to understanding the sort of the future prospects of the reset. Yesterday I received the final version of a report called The US-Russia Relations After the Reset, Building a New Agenda. And it's written out of the Council it's the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy run by Sergei Karaganov. And Karaganov and Lukyanov would be regarded, I think, by most people in this room as relatively progressive, enlightened, committed to long-term cooperation with the United States and Europe. And here's what they had to say, and this is relevant particularly to Constance's question. I quote, "Thanks to the success of the reset of the US-Russia relations, US policy, for the first time since the mid-1990s, does not undermine Russia's vital interests, for example, in the post-Soviet space." Now, what that reveals is that even a progressive, a modernizer, a liberal like Karaganov believes that Russia has a sphere of vital interest in the post-Soviet space. First, and second, that they believe that the Americans have effectively signed on to Russian leadership in the post-Soviet space. I'll just leave it there.
Yes.
Okay.
Can I respond to that?
All right. Well, let me... All right, well taken. Go ahead, Jeremy, quickly.
Yeah, no, I can't really speak to what Sergei Karaganov believes. I can say that we do not recognize a Russian sphere of influence.
No.
But
they think you do, though.
But that's the point. That was the point I was about to get to. They don't think that we do. And the way that I know this is because they're constantly saying to us, you are not recognizing our sphere of influence. Okay. And we say, you don't have one. And we go round and round on this. It's a very unfun conversation, but it is not a recognition that we do not accept, and they don't think that we accept their sphere of influence. We are fighting about this all the time. We are fighting about it around Georgia. We are fighting about it around Transnistria. We are fighting about it in Central Asia. And I can tell you the Russians are not happy with our actions in this regard, despite what Sergei might say. I think the reason that one of the things that the reset has given us is we have given the Russians a stake in the relationship in a variety of ways, that these sphere of influence differences that we still very prominently have, and which really frustrate the Russians. Missile defense is another one. Don't spill over into other parts of the relationship, and don't queer the other things that we're trying to do that don't touch on sphere of influence questions. But it remains a huge problem in the relationship, and I think the Russians see it that way too.
But is that perception that Karaganov had a central element of a clear strategy of delinkage? In other words, that Russian internal behavior or external behavior vis-a-vis its neighbors doesn't have to impact these other broader strategic interests.
We have made clear, I think, to the Russians that we don't accept these types of sphere of influence actions. And in Georgia, we are standing with the Georgian government and constantly reasserting their sovereignty and territorial integrity and supporting their claims vis-a-vis the Russians. So there hasn't been any from us quid pro quo. Oh, we won't do this if you sign the START treaty. That hasn't happened. No one has really accused us of that, and the Georgian government themselves have been willing to say that this has been helpful to them in getting a better relationship and being able to negotiate better with the Russians.
Okay, let me give Mr. Nikitin just for a minute, and then I want to go back to the several questions.
Yes, comparing the just verbal expression, transatlantic link. And this audience sounds very natural, necessary, timely. CIS link. You should skip it immediately. No rights, no way. And there is something wrong in this logic, because it reminds me of the old Ukrainian anecdote that in 1961, when Gagarin went to space, a young Ukrainian boy comes to his father and says, you know, grandfather, Russians went to the outer space. And the grandfather asks, I hope all of them? And that's what you expect. I mean, Constance asked the question that, yes, maybe you are moving in the right direction of recognizing the end of post-Soviet space, but why so slowly? Why you are still there? Vacated at all. But we cannot vacate the space where the country is situated, where the natural ties between certain countries exist. And what's new in this situation that both Russian elites and Russian population already, so to say, vacated in strategic thinking areas like Baltic states. We consider this as a natural part of Europe. Certain states in South Caucasus, for example, Azerbaijan, is perceived as a part of some different geostrategic pattern. And if we count what is remaining, it's probably only 7 CSTO states which, on the level of presidents, decided that they compose some kind of alliance. They are partners, allies, they are doing political, military, economic projects together, and do not expect that CSTO would dismiss as the Soviet Union did before. So wrapping it up, let me say that, for example, in Transnistria, the difference in Russian position is dramatic. The readiness and willingness to see European Union at the negotiations table is really something very, very new from 1999, when Yeltsin said, because of Western position on Transnistria, I do not sign OSCE communique, I do not sign the CFA treaty, I go home and maybe Russia will withdraw from OSCE. That was Yeltsin's approach in 1999. And the approach today is that we do understand that Russia only cannot be the chief conflict resolutor for such areas as South Caucasus or Transnistria. We need to do this together with NATO, with European Union, with OSCE.
Okay, good. All right, we have about 15 or 20 minutes for discussion. I want to take 3 crisp questions, please, if you will. There's a lady here right in the middle, Ambassador Kovanda, and then Oksana over here.
Thank you. Yelena Kristylova, Bristol University. I have 2 questions, very brief questions.
No more questions.
One for Mr. Shapiro, please. In your introduction, you emphasized the values-based approach, while obviously taking some practical steps. But you do realize that obviously Russia is governed by an absolutely different set of values, which do not really sit easily with this kind of liberal democracy paradigm. So don't you think that taking this principled approach is not really conducive, is not particularly useful, and in fact may shut more doors than open them? And my second question is for Professor Nikitin. I really enjoyed your phrase, and here I quote you, the feeling in Russia of the end of post-communist imperial rule. And here I just would like to ask, how would you perhaps reconcile it, this feeling or this perception, with the daily practices of far more sophisticated steps that Russia now takes in order to penetrate the sovereign space of Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova? I'm not just talking about being stationed and having military presence, but taking more sophisticated and softer steps to remain as viable and as agile as it was before in the post-Soviet space. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's Ambassador Kovanda over there. I can't see you in the light here.
Thank you. Is this working today?
Yes, yes.
I'm Karl Kovanda, until recently a senior official of the European Commission. Stephen, I didn't take down the exact word, but in a throwaway sentence, BOBO said the reset policy is bound to falter or fail. Perhaps you could elaborate.
Sure.
That might be sort of a good thing to close this thing on, for that matter.
We're going to come back to that actually a little bit. And then Oksana over here. Okay. Oksana, no? Okay, you...
Anyway, I have a very short comment and quick question. The short comment is that BOBO has just interpreted the phrase from Karaganov's report saying Russia has vital interest into reinterpreting it into sphere of vital interest, which the report doesn't say. And in fact, the sphere's language has not been used for a very long time. Now, if you need an evidence of how much Russian policy changed in the post-Soviet space, just 5 quick examples. One, what Phil Gordon said yesterday about Nagorno-Karabakh. For the first time, we have a very close cooperation between the 3 co-chairs on Nagorno-Karabakh. Never happened before. Kyrgyzstan, for the first time, there has not really been tensions. I mean, I agree with Alexander that maybe the cooperation was not very effective yet, but for the first time, there was no tensions over the crisis. Uzbekistan, United States just opened 2 military facilities new in Uzbekistan. There has not been any pressure from the Russian side not to do it, and there has not been any impact on the Russian-Uzbek relations. Astana summit in Kazakhstan just happened a few months ago. Russia came with its own agenda. None of its agenda items were accepted by the Kazakh counterparts of Russia. No impact on Russian-Kazakh relations. They remain to be good, and in fact, all the red lines which the international community wanted to observe in Astana hold. All of these things are new. And they're concrete examples. They're not propaganda or statements. They're concrete examples of the fact that things are happening. Are they happening very radically, that today, as Alexander said, all the Russians went in outer space? Of course not. Are things still continue in Belarus and Ukraine? Absolutely. But, it is just, we have to see where the trend is going and stop being completely ideological. We have to just look at the facts. Okay. The quick question is about WTO. Right. We have both of American and the EU counterparts said very clearly they want to see Russia in WTO. We know where the problem lies. Back to Konstantin's question on Georgia. And at the moment, there is really no parameters of the compromise. And the Georgians made it absolutely clear that unless this change is going to be coming about, there will not be Russian membership in WTO. And that is a very clear practical conflict of interest here. What are the leverages? What are the ways that the United States and Europe can influence the situation? Because if not, there will be no Russian WTO.
If you would just pass the microphone right behind you to Ambassador Butora. I have the feeling that he and Eugenius want to talk about the linkages questions, but go ahead. Just as a 2-finger, they were indicating 2 fingers, so I'll just...
Thanks, Martin Butra, Bratislava. If I may, I will use a metaphorical language, and it's a question for Professor Nikitin. There is this famous story when President Sarkozy arrived to Moscow to visit. So at the airport, he was asked, "So why did you come here, Mr. President?" And he said, "Well, I want to understand Russia." And then Putin answered, "Well, to understand Russia, you know, we have a famous poet, Tuchev, and he quoted Tuchev, umom Rasiu nepoňať, a širom občím neizmieriť, u neho особенно stať v Rasiu možno toľko veriť." It means you cannot understand Russia by a rational way, you just have to trust Russia. So my question is, after the reset, after this first part of the reset, metaphorically, which Russian poet will be quoted by President Medvedev to President Obama? But more seriously, do you think that now the Russian policy is more understandable? That is not just we have to trust the Russians, but we really know what they really want? Thanks.
Okay, and then just quickly, Eugene Smola.
Eugene Smola, Center for International Polish Institute for International Affairs, Warsaw, now in Brussels. I have a bit of a problem. I wouldn't quote Georgia. I would quote Kuril Islands.
Okay.
I would go to Asia. I would say that if we are looking for an example of the very traditional approach of Russia into foreign policy and needing investment in Siberia from Japan, Japan says, well, we are going to look for a better place for our money. That's full stop. The Japanese investment in Russia is at the very minimal level, even if it moved lately. Kyrgyzstan. This is a very interesting example. I heard yesterday Oksana, but actually I was in Moscow and I talked to some people and they said, would US move one finger, we would intervene. So we are facing, it was from the very, very high military official. And
which finger would we move?
No, well, if you would show an inclination, NATO or US inclination to intervene, to get engaged, Russia would feel obliged to do the same. Mirror image kind of a policy.
So would I. Yeah.
So the question when there was this famous or infamous letter of ex-leaders to Obama administration, you remember, which some of you have reacted in a very you thought it's unhappy occasion. Well, it wasn't about that new Obama administration is idealistic, but we saw that you closed your eyes and decided to do it in spite of. You know, it is not the case. And I agree that many people in Central Europe look at the policy, we enjoy it, we are smiling to the Russians, Russians are smiling back. We hope that there will be some substance in the future, but there is no substance. And the last moment is something which BOBO have said about Europe and European capitals. This is, I find, the new phenomenon of certain pessimism, even in relation with Russia, and the source of pessimism is not missile defense or anything, but economy.
Yeah.
Russia is not moving, and the 30 minutes meeting of Angela Merkel with Putin lately in Berlin was about that. And she said, governments will not invest in Russia. Business will invest in Russia, and business is afraid investing in Russia.
Okay.
So when we are talking about reset, from our point of view, it's of course the strategy that matters to the United States, but for us it matters the whole comprehensive package is important, and we don't see that package.
Okay, a lot of good issues on the
Which is
table.
not
We want to
fault
come
of
back.
the United
Let's
States
start
of
with
America.
Jeremy, do you want to talk the question about the principled approach, the issue of some of the questions related to linkage, perhaps, and then we'll.
I'm not sure I fully understood the question about a values-based approach. It's not an approach which is based on Russian values. We are not naive about the Russians, and we certainly understand that they have different views of the world and different approaches to us, and we don't look upon President Medvedev as some sort of liberal hero. I think we understand very well that he is part of the system. And that there's a lot of things in that system that need to be revised. When I said that it was a values-based approach, I was talking about our values. And that's who we are. That's the only way that we can approach a problem. We thought it was very important, both for the audiences that would see the reset, but also to guide ourselves to lay out a certain number of principles about what this reset would and wouldn't be. And we wanted to make it very clear that it wouldn't be conceding spheres of influence, that it wouldn't be abandoning allies or partners, and and that it wouldn't come at the expense of other parties. And I think we've stuck to those principles, and it was helpful, I think, to lay them out, because otherwise it wouldn't have been as clear to the audiences what we were doing, and in the U.S. government it might not have been as clear to us.
But I think inherent in this question, and others have posed it in different ways, is, but inevitably, as in with Soviet times, when behavior became more repressive internally, wasn't it inevitably going to impact the foreign relations with the West? Can you really have a full insulation of the process, saying that, well, we still have these strategic interests?
It can, and it does. But what the delinkage concept is that what we had noticed in the previous administration is that getting upset about things that the Russians were doing that we didn't approve of and linking them to other issues didn't improve the things that we were upset about. It just made worse the things that we weren't upset about. And the idea was to create some momentum in the things that we could agree upon and hope that they would spill over into the things that we fight about. And we've had some modest success in that, but there is still a lot that we disagree on. And I just think it's really important to sort of run the thought experiment and say, would human rights in Russia be better today if the U.S.-Russian relationship was bad? Would the countries of the Baltic states feel more secure if U.S.-Russian relations were bad? And I don't think that these things are the case.
Okay. Let me just ask Ambassador LAJČák to react to some of this, and then Dr. Lowe.
One sentence of WTO. It's obvious that it is in our interest to have Russia there, and we've done our part. We removed the obstacles that were there. Now it's for Russia to sit down with Georgia and to talk, which wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. So this is not what we are going to do on behalf of Russia. But we are encouraging Moscow to sit down and to talk to Tbilisi. That's the best way forward.
That's the same way that we are approaching it.
Yeah, look, Oksana, we Australians tend not to be very ideological animals, really. Can I just say, though, that sorry? Yes, I've got it right here, actually. It talks about Russia's vital interest in the post-Soviet space. When you ally that to what Jeremy has just said about the Russians bitching about the Americans not being more complaisant about Russian interests in the post-Soviet space, you have to ask, surely you have to ask, whether there might not be a substantial patrimonial mentality that's still very much in place. I think it's, frankly, wrong to deny that. Now, the second issue is, you talk about changes. And yes, Russian policy towards the post-Soviet space has become much more nuanced, more sophisticated, less ham-fisted, no question. But it's still fundamentally, in my opinion, about style over substance. You talk about the Russian failure to get what it wanted in the Astana summit. I would argue it's not Russian restraint in the post-Soviet space. The key element, the key variable, is Russian lack of success in pushing their objectives. Simply, there is much more kickback because the Central Asians, for example, are in a much stronger position because they can not only play the American card, they can play the China card as well. So Russia's strategic position and ability to tell the Central Asians what to do is much, much diminished. And so they're, in a sense, making a virtue out of a necessity. The third thing on picking up Zhenek's point about Russian Asia, I wanted to pick up, because it was something that was raised in your presentation yesterday, the Russian interest in Asia. Again, I see this fundamentally as more rhetorical, more stylistic, more a wish list than, more aspiration than achievement. It seems to me that Russia fundamentally, its objectives in Asia are to have so-called strategic relations with the major Asian powers, but specifically China and India. It is not so much to engage with a sort of semi-abstract concept of Asia. And actually, it's not just the Russians' fault. It's the Asians' fault. You mentioned the sort of the courtesy that was afforded the Russian Deputy Prime Minister at the Shangri-La Summit. In November, I attended for 3 days a Ditchley Park conference on the global rise of Asia and its implications for the world. In the course of 3 days, there were many, many high-level Indian and Chinese and other Asian representatives. they did not mention Russia once. Not once. Now, the tidal wave of indifference is extraordinary. So, I mean, that's really worth remembering. And finally, on the future of the reset, or are we going to have a separate... on the future of the reset, I don't see, in a sense, most of the achievements have been low-hanging fruit. They have seemed higher-hanging because of the difficulties in actually plucking these low-hanging fruits. START ratification, for example, turned out to be far more difficult than originally anticipated. But I think things are going to be much more difficult. The next steps, for example, what further concessions are the Russians going to give on Iran? Frankly, none. How much more can they do on Afghanistan? Not very much. Are they going to change their... are they going to modernize and democratize and there's going to be a sort of some kind of normative convergence? Frankly, doesn't look good. So the difficulty here is I don't actually see a new crisis. I don't think things will go back to what they were in 2008. But what I do see, so it's not a rethink or continue. I see a kind of stagnation or a drift. The sort of US-Russia relations will meander along and sort of rather waiting for the sort of number 73 bus, eventually another label will come along. And we'll call it maybe normalization, maybe partnership for modernization, or if we're really lucky, we can even confer the ultimate accolade, strategic partnership.
Okay, I want to turn to Dr. Nikitin on the issue of the post-imperial thinking. Is it taking hold? Is there still spheres of influence either in Central Europe, the Caucasus, but even as Eugene has mentioned in East Asia? Is sphere of influence thinking still quite alive and well in Russia?
You remember a day ago, a gentleman from Netherlands asked from the audience, colleague Central Europeans, how much reassurance is enough? Somebody answered, it never will be enough. So now the same logic, if we reverse it a little bit, it sounds like you are constantly asking, okay, Russia did change here and change there. Why not Kurils yet? We want reassurance too. Let me repeat, we want reassurance from the Western family of nations, and this reassurance about what? About involvement, full and sincere involvement of Russia into the European family of nations. And at a certain stage, with all the changes which Russia is doing and will be doing, and we're speaking about the future of reset, I hope that at a certain moment the European and American partners would already, just by pragmatic flow of events, start to work with Russia as with the real partner, not as with the other side. And here we come into these debates around, say, Karaganov and which poet better represent Russia now. You see, Russia is a big country and even elites are quite split. And my good friend Karaganov is liberal but pragmatist.
He's a liberal imperialist?
A kind of person who always liked Morgenthau and who really is ready to see the world in this like balances of big powers. There are different people, different elites who really perceive that they live not inside Russia. They live in the modern world, which is very much globalized. We live in Europe in a sense, and probably we need the whole compilation of quotations from several poets now to describe that, yes, there are Russians who are still with Tuchev, who think that Russia is a very specific, selfish Eurasian country, and there are others who are very much on the understanding that Russia is a normal European country, and even some who say that we and Americans resemble each other very much in certain respects, by mentality, by strategic feelings, and so on. From this point of view, let me remind you that a lot of 180 degrees of change were done already. Remember, in the same above-mentioned Asia, Soviet Union was very much supporting North Korea. Where is Russia now? Very much extending relations with South Korea and is as cautious about North Koreans as the West is. Look to the Israeli-Arab dialogue. Before, Soviet Union was definitely on the side of the Arab world, Syria, all that. Now Israel is a pragmatic friend of Russia with a lot of interface, a lot of trade, and a lot of suspicions in Russia about the intentions of the Arab leaders. We are on the same ground, and even now on these Tahrir revolutions, practically perception is, cautious perception is the same in Moscow and, say, in Brussels and Washington. Look at Vietnam, look at relations with China, look at relations with socialist-oriented, former socialist-oriented countries of Africa. Moscow changed a lot of such attitudes 180 degrees. But do not expect that every possible position is to be changed. In fact, there are points in the geopolitical orientation of Russia which would remain, which are dictated by some geopolitical parameters, some others by correlation of domestic forces. And please do not confuse Russian authorities and Russian society. Society is much more pluralistic, much more interesting, so to say, from the European point of view than the authorities are. From this point of view, let me remind you that I'm professor of the university. I do not represent State Department. And in fact, yes. And from this point of view, let me end on wrap up this part on the phrase that Russia wants reassurance that at certain moment we all would feel that we are normal members of the European family.
Okay, we're cutting a little bit into the network lunch, but we did start late, so I hope you'll indulge us. There's plenty of time for lunch. And besides, I worked in the Clinton administration, and we're absolutely right on time. This is 20 minutes late. We're Clinton Standard Time, right on time. So Central European Time, Clinton Standard Time, fortunately.
This is the Obama administration.
Right, but I know. Anyway, but I do want to add the last question. So what could go wrong? What could go right? How durable, the organizers put to us, the first question they put to us in the program was, can it survive Obama and Medvedev? But let's put it another way. What can go well in this relationship? How might it collapse in terms of a deepening and thickening of ties and a continued ability to operate with this delinkage? But let me start, Ambassador. Let you take that first.
Well, that's and even today's discussion shows how complex this issue is, and it's about whether we want to see the half full or half empty glass here. What I have been trying to stress is that we have a positive tendency, positive trend, and we have to build on positive elements and be demanding yet patient. And that's probably, as I see, the only way forward here. Yeah. So this is what I've tried to stress, and it's really important that we have the understanding among the major partners in this game.
What could stress European strategic patience? Or would you accept that
Europe has traditionally been patient?
And both,
yes.
both sides of Europe had the same degree of strategic patience. Let's put it that way.
Europe is known for
old
being
Europe and New Europe, to use the old.
Not necessarily fast, but steady. And that's also our philosophy here. It's not about strategic patience. It's about developing relationship and partnership, but reflecting our expectations and our needs and our values in it. So it must be, of course, two-way street here. And patience is something I cannot define, and I don't think we have to speak about patience here. We are moving forward, in the right way or wrong way. And what we are trying to do is to make sure that we are moving forward in the right way.
Okay. Mr. Shapiro.
Yeah, I find that my European colleague has stolen quite a bit of my thunder, which I guess is sort of bad for my presentation, but good for our relationship. From my perspective, when you think about this conversation, it was very much, is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? If you project that into the future, you're unlikely to get greater clarity. I don't really know how the relationship is going to evolve. I didn't even get the memo about the North African revolutions until they happened. So I can't really predict where this is going, but I do think that it's important that we have put it on a pretty good trajectory, that we are making progress, that we are slowly building a foundation on which we can hope to do better things, and then we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens within Russia. We'll have to see what happens within Europe and the United States. But I think we at least have a direction in which we want to go forward, and we have a moderately positive trend that we can build on. There is no clear limit to it. It's not as if one thing happens in Russia, one election, one economic cataclysm, because the whole point is to create a sense on both sides and within Europe that there is a stake in the relationship and there are things to lose, and so it's more able to survive upsets, since certainly some will come.
Okay. Professor NIKITIN. Well, let's ask you.
Yeah, realistic.
And also, if you could touch a little bit on one thing we haven't really. What about the NATO-Russia relationship? How do you see that evolving? And all the agreements that were reached in Lisbon, or at least the work plan to move forward. How do you see that moving?
Yeah, regarding 2012, we all understand that the only realistic choice is between Medvedev and Putin. If Medvedev stays, then he has no motivation to ruin these reset relations with Americans, because he already invested his name, his foreign policy program into this. If Putin comes, let me remind you what happened on the day of 9/11. Putin was the first out of foreign presidents who used the nuclear hotline to get to American president, and he said that first, this is not us. Second, we are ready to support you. I'm serious. Second, Kremlin, we are ready to support you in your anti-terrorist campaign, but you please change your attitude toward our anti-terrorist campaign. Now you see that it works both ways. So as a chess player, as a very pragmatic and rational chess player, Putin simply suggested a kind of a deal. And in a sense, this reset is a very chess-like deal between Moscow and Washington, and Putin has its own logic to follow it. So I do not expect in 2012, as the outcome of the elections, the real change in this respect. And now the question regarding NATO. You know, let me say something paradoxical, that the real security threats and challenges of Russia cannot be tackled through relations with the West, and specifically with NATO. NATO is not per se, and not in security area, important for Russia. NATO is a kind of translator. Through Brussels, we speak to the West as a whole. Through NATO, we speak about the geopolitical correlation of forces in the modern world. We speak about the role of Russia in the decision-makers table in Europe. But if we count the real security problems of Russia, like instability in Central Asia and the problems of South Caucasus and specifically of North Caucasus, the 16 nations which emerged in North Caucasus part of Russian Federation, and transborder illegal migration, and the narcotics which flow from Afghanistan. Practically in none, or say terrorism in Moscow and in other cities of the country, in none of these issues we really can improve the security situation by signing papers with NATO. NATO is a useful interlocutor in this process and for general improvement of the security atmosphere, the same way as my American colleague said that Russian-American reset improves the general atmosphere for conflict resolution for various contradictions. The same way, the improvement of relations with NATO, the progress in relations with NATO eases our approaches to our real security problems, but they are not here. I mean, the western flank is the most pleasant flank for the Russian army. I mean, everything is quiet here, and it's more cooperative than contradictory. And Lisbon summit was interesting. If again we come to a chess player, now we feel that the ball is on our side, because we, after new strategic concept of NATO, which provided a much more modern wording, much better wording than sometimes we expected. Now we need probably to redefine the last edition of the Russian military doctrine, which was adopted before Lisbon, and which is slightly more contradictory and needs like refreshment and redesign. Reset. Good. Right. So probably we need next. Oh, we just cooked next topic for discussion.
NATO is a danger.
Next
NATO is a partner that could become a
problem.
problem.
Yes.
But yeah, that would be good.
Next topic for discussion for Globsec 2012, reset of relations between Russia and NATO. Thanks.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, BOBO, I'll give you the chance to pick up a number of different threads here, and particularly on what could go wrong, what could go right, and And maybe also we didn't talk about what more can we expect from Russia on Iran, if you want to touch on that as well.
Okay,
so that's a lot.
That'll be a short answer.
Yeah.
There are a number of problems number of concerns that I have. The first is that it's not only, as I mentioned before, that Russia will be tougher in giving away concessions. So I don't see it making any more serious concessions. The fact that they've been so critical about the unilateral sort of the added sanctions introduced by the United States and the European Union has bothered them. Partly it's an issue, they have a complaint about process, they weren't involved, but partly it's also they feel the substance of the policy is wrong. And so that concerns me. What also concerns me is that not only that Russia will become a tougher negotiator on many issues, but there is also a danger, in my opinion, of overconfidence. And this comes back to the sort of the issue of booming oil and commodity prices. If they continue to go up, it seems to me that Moscow will not be more conciliatory. It will see itself, rightly or wrongly, as being in a stronger position. And that does concern me. The second problem I see is both in the United States and in Russia, there are very, very strong anti-reset constituencies. So even when the governments on both sides are prepared to, if you like, push through positive changes in Russia-US relations, they're going to find it, and this is particularly true in Washington, they're going to find it very, very hard to drive through, to actually, convert aspiration into achievement. Then, of course, there are events. And now, if Obama should lose in 2012, that would be an event. But actually, I don't see that as the most crucial game changer. There could be, for example, for the sake of argument, change of administration in Kyiv and possible attempts to revise the Kharkiv agreement. There could be a new round of confrontation between Moscow and Tbilisi. There could be deployment of, in fact there will be, deployment of US missile defense systems in one form or another. There will be mounting stability in former Soviet Central Asia, I think particularly likely now. And I think there'll be rising tensions over Iran, because eventually the Israelis will lose patience. There will be some kind of military action, in my opinion. What's going to be the effect on Russia-US relations then? So if I want to sort of I'm going to try and be positive and say that I want to go back to my original message about the pivotal importance of modernization. Because ultimately that is the best chance. If Russia modernizes, and it can be modernization with Russian characteristics, and westernizing it can be wholly imperfect. But if there is genuine movement towards modernization, then this modernization will mean that Russia will be less obsessive about its so-called great power entitlements. It'll be more committed to long-term strategic cooperation with Europe and with the United States. But I think we need to acknowledge that this transformation will be uneven, it'll be gradual, and it'll be very protracted. It'll take a very long time. My concern, however, is that if you have a non-modernizing Russia, you see the consolidation and expansion even of authoritarianism at home, of a sense of entitlement overseas, and more generally, at home and abroad, a rising tide of nationalism. And this is clearly going to seriously complicate relations with the United States and Europe.
You need to work harder on your optimism.
Yeah. No, so the final thing, really, and actually I do agree with Jeremy and Ambassador LAJČák here. We need to retain a sense of perspective. We need to actually appreciate what has been done, but we also need to moderate our expectations. We need to sort of accept that, it's not going to revolutionize the relationship necessarily, that there is an awful lot of work, and we need to avoid, therefore, this trap, because US-Russia relations have gone through extraordinary peaks and troughs in the last 20 years. We need to ensure that, in a sense, a state of boringness is actually a no bad thing here.
That's a good point. And any speculation on what poet Medvedev will be quoting, or will he be quoting poets, or will someone else be quoting?
No, I'm probably deep purple, I think.
All right. Well, thank you all for many good questions, for your strategic patience. Thank our panelists for a great, a real interactive debate as we were asked to provide, and thanks to the organizers for a great forum.